Joining us now from New York is Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister and now Middle East envoy for the Quartet. That is the US, the UN, the European Union and Russia. Mr. Blair, welcome to the Al Jazeera News Hour. With the news of what John Kerry hopes will push the peace process forward, have you got any reason to feel remotely optimistic?
Well, I've got reason to feel more optimistic than a few months back, because there was no process in place at all then. So we've got a political track. The parties are in direct negotiation. It's a timetabled negotiation as well. And there's a whole set of economic measures that we're seeking to put alongside that political track. So, of course, the challenges remain, and it's still very difficult, but I'm more optimistic. There was a greater mood of optimism, actually, at the meeting today than I've seen for several years.
Challenges remain. It's going to be very difficult. I'm sure you've said that before. And after 6 years as Middle East envoy, what is it? More than 100 trips to the Middle East. Not much has changed.
Well, what hasn't happened, by the way, is that the whole thing is destabilized in the way the rest of the region has, and that's been important. And actually, until about 2 years ago, we were managing to get reasonably strong economic growth in the West Bank. But, look, you're right, and the thing is that this is an issue where unless you have a real political will and heft behind anything you're doing, it's not going to work. Now, the change, to be fair, is John Kerry, never mind my trips to the Middle East, more important, the trips that he's made over these last months, has seen a resurgence of political weight behind this process, a relaunched political negotiation, and we're now producing what will certainly be the most comprehensive economic initiative for the Palestinian economy. There are still lots of things that we need to get right, by the way, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, and I'm not diminishing any of these problems, but the one thing you learn about these peace processes is that you can go along not getting very far for several years, but then when the window of opportunity opens, you've got to go through it.
You see, the assumption is among many Palestinians that you've all been very soft on Israel.
Sure, and then you hear from the Israelis that we don't do nearly enough to deal with the issues they have with the Palestinians. Look, one thing came through the meeting today very, very clearly. There is no way that we will get a political negotiation that's successful unless there is a Palestinian state that is a state that is based on the 67 lines with agreed land swaps. That's what people want to see, and that's going to require quite painful compromises by both sides. In addition, we won't get the economic changes we need unless there's reforms within the Palestinian Authority and the enabling environment from the Israelis in terms of restrictions and access and so on. So I think we know what we've got to do, but doing it as ever is the key thing.
Yeah, and of course there are so many regional implications to everything you do as Middle East envoy. Let's move on to Syria. The Russians a few minutes ago saying, look, there was no chance of there being a resolution pretty soon, as had been leaked by some Western diplomats a short while ago. I want to read you something that you wrote in the London Sunday Times a short while ago about the Syrian people. We are not on their side when they need us. They've been let down badly, do you think?
Look, it's, I've been, having gone through Iraq, Afghanistan, I know how difficult these decisions are for political leaders, and I also know how fatigued, frankly, the public is in the West with the idea of intervention. But I do think we've got to be very mindful of the fact that if we don't get a way of stabilizing the situation of Syria and then changing it, it's not just the utter suffering of the people. I mean, over 100,000 people dead and millions displaced. It's that the whole of the region will suffer, and Syria as a country will continue on this process of disintegration. So, look, I know it's difficult, and I think, they're right to try and make sure that the Syrians give up their chemical weapons and to try and get the Russians on board for that. But even if we deal with the chemical weapons issue, the conflict still goes on, and for the people that are dying, if they're dying even through conventional weapons, it's something we've got to try and stop. And my own view is we need to yes, try and get back to a political negotiation, but that will only happen if it's absolutely clear that we are determined to back up anything we do with the threat of force.
Absolutely. That was going to be my next question. You know, with the threat of force, do you think there will be regime change, or do you believe that President Assad will stay in power?
I mean, I can't predict the answer to that question right now, but I can't see any basis on which he can remain in power. Now, there are all sorts of ways that you can get an agreement for a transition to a new constitution in which the majority of the country can decide its government. And, you know, let's be clear about it, that there are real anxieties and concerns about the people. You mentioned Jabhat al-Nusra a short time ago, some of the people in the opposition camp, and you know, there have been atrocities committed by them as well. You know, we've got to put that on the table and be honest about it. But I think, you know, what I would like to see is the West having taken, you know, a decision to take a strong position on the issue of chemical weapons, then take a strong position on the resolution of this conflict as a whole, because, you know, the regional implications are huge. And I think, by the way, the bill for us in the West, if we allow this disintegration to happen, so you end up with a de facto partition of Syria, I think the bill for us is going to be very heavy in the long term.
Do you think that there are people, perhaps count Israel amongst them, who would rather see Assad stay in power to lend some kind of stability to a region which desperately needs anything like that?
Right, but I think, I'm sure that there will be certain people who think that, but here's what I think the last few years have taught us, and they've taught this to Western policymakers as well. You know, the notion that you will maintain stability by keeping in power dictatorial regimes who are not allowing their people to voice their concerns and have a say in their government in the way they want to. The notion that you provide stability that way, I think, has been broken by what has happened in the last few years.
But it isn't that simple, is it? I'm sorry to butt in. I mean, you've seen what's happened in Egypt.
Sure.
You know, when one dictator was removed and no stability in that country whatsoever.
Right. So this is the problem. But on the other hand, the dictators aren't going to stay in power either. I mean, that's what's very clear, because the people aren't going to accept it. So the question is, can you get I mean, what I would prefer to see is a policy that allows for an evolutionary change over time, and on the basis of the only way that democracy works. And this is one thing I think is really important for people in the region to understand. Democracy is a way of thinking, it's not just a way of voting. And it doesn't work unless you have a pluralistic concept of democracy where people of different faiths and cultures can respect each other and tolerate each other. You know, there is no concept of democracy, in my view, that works where the majority just take power and then suppress the minority. So, you know, we've got a lot of work to do, not merely in trying to steer a new path for the region, but in showing that the only thing that works is that evolutionary process of change motivated by values and principles that are open-minded and tolerant and not closed-minded and sectarian.
A quick thought, if you would, on Iran and the new leader there, Hassan Rouhani. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, said his speech, that's Rouhani's speech to the UN, was cynical and full of hypocrisy. What do you make of that?
What I make of it is that I think if Iran wanted a negotiated solution to this, that would be great. I mean, no one wants to see a conflict. And I think President Obama is perfectly sensible to test it out. But I think we should test it with our eyes open and with a mind that is informed by what has happened in the past. So, you know, the speeches I think are welcome insofar as they show a different attitude. But the actions are the things that count, because I genuinely believe a nuclear-armed Iran would be a disaster for this region.
I want to ask you one final question, Mr. Blair. Round about 12 months ago, leading newspaper in Britain canvassed the opinions of a number of politicians in the West Bank and Gaza. And the headline that day in December of last year in The Independent was "Useless, useless, useless. The Palestinian verdict on Tony Blair's job." Do you think you're doing some good?
Well, I hope so. And by the way, that's one person's opinion. And one of the things you get used to in politics, David, is that you're not going to please everyone or all the people all of the time. And when you engage in something like the Middle East peace process, you're lucky if you please anyone any of the time. So, yeah, no, of course, there are a whole series of changes that I could point to that we've achieved. But the reason I'm still working at it is I know we've not done what we want to do. But we're not going to be able to do that, really, you know, unless you get a political environment that's going to enable this to happen.
Well, it's very interesting to talk to you. Tony Blair, we thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme.
Thank you.